Welcome to the last session of today, our plenary session titled Trade and Macroeconomic Challenges in South Asia. As chair, we have with us Dr. Zaidi Sattar, Chairman, Policy Research Institute of Bangladesh. Our keynote speaker will be Dr. Francisca, Chief Economist, South Asia Region, the World Bank. She will be joining online. We have four distinguished panelists with us. Two of them with us. Dr. Rajan Krishna Panta, Director, Nepal Rashtra Bank, Professor Mostafizur Rahman, Distinguished Fellow, Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh. Dr. Shirimal Abiratne will be joining us online, and Dr. Anirudh Shingal, Professor and Department Chair, Economics and Policy, SP Jain Institute of Management and Research, will also be joining us online. We would like to hand over the session to our Honorable Session Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Master of Ceremonies, and good evening to everybody present. Very distinguished gathering, I can see, and I have very distinguished colleagues with me here, and welcome to the new world of seminars, which is hybrid. We have presenters and distinguished panelists online as well as physically present. So, and that is exactly how we are going to do this session. This is going to be about the broad definition, of course, is the trade and macroeconomic challenges. But we have, as our keynote presenter, Chief Economist of South Asia in the World Bank. And, we have been, as a former banker, I've, interacted so much with the various chief economists of South Asia in the World Bank. And of course, one of my colleagues, Dr. Sadiq Ahmed, was also a chief economist for South Asia. So, there's been a lot of interaction and, interchange of ideas when it comes to South Asia economic management, economic policies particularly, and I have spent a lot of time looking at trade policies in South Asia. I had the privilege of leading a famous, it's a seminal report of the World Bank back in the late 1990s, a review of trade policies in South Asia. So that was the first time, I think, we looked at where South Asian trade policies stood at that time. After the initial liberalization phase in 1991 by Mr. Manmohan Singh, Finance Minister of India, by Mr. Saifur Rahman, Finance Minister of Bangladesh, and also the Finance Minister of Pakistan also did liberalize and did some trade reforms. Our conclusion at the end of 1990s, after those liberalizing reforms, was that India was still the most restrictive, had the most restrictive trade regime, while Sri Lanka was had the most open economy. But Sri Lanka didn't have to do much reforms. Sri Lanka started its trade liberalizing reforms back in the early 1970s. So that's how it was. And today, I'm sure you find out that it's probably the opposite. Sri Lanka is probably the most restrictive right now because the insurgencies and things that went on in Sri Lanka, so things had changed. I'm not going to talk too much about your presentation. I did read your presentation as much as I could and tried to understand. And I agree with you when you talk about the fact that imports are highly restricted in the whole of South Asia. And I remember, I think almost a year ago when you said South Asian countries are more inward-looking, and I think that also remains today. As far as Bangladesh is concerned, the import penetration imports as a percentage of GDP is down to only 6%. So you point out in your first three questions import restrictions and exports not boosting exports. So when it comes to import penetration, South Asia's average is something like 20-25%, when the world's average is 50% of GDP. And East Asia is 40-60% of GDP. So we are really behind. And one of the other comments about South Asia when it comes to trade restrictiveness is South Asian countries tend to discriminate against the neighbors compared to the rest of the world. So they do more trade with the rest of the world than with their immediate neighbors. That is one characteristic of South Asia. So you start off with, these three questions, and we're going to listen to very carefully your statement. And of course, there will be our distinguished panelists also giving you some feedback and hopefully some critique. And so we all look forward to listening to your presentation. And I hope you bring up some controversial issues, some critiques of what is going on. And certainly, overall, our impression is that South Asia is it's just hanging in there compared to other regions like East Asia. We're way behind East Asia when it comes to managing trade policies. Not only is imports restricted, and therefore it hurts boosting exports. We tend to be obsessed with exports and without realizing that we need imports, particularly high-quality inputs, in order to boost exports. So that is where the challenge lies, and we'd like to hear from you how. And sorry, before I leave, you are also focusing on the employment implications of trade policies, and you do look at some trade reform that did take place recently. Unfortunately, nothing happened in Bangladesh in the last 20 years. Not much reform in trade area took place. What happened was early 1991, and that's where we ended. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward, and all of us are looking forward to your presentation. Over to you, Franziska Onsorke.
Thank you, Dr. Satta. Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself on the main messages of our work. Let me share my screen here. I think you can see it now, right? The slides. So yes, you've already picked this up. You've given the audience already the guidance of my talk. Sorry, I'll switch on the timer. So if it beeps in 25 minutes, apologies, this is my timer. I'm trying to stick to my time. So I go through three questions here. First, South Asia really stands out in its use of trade policies. And I want to show you that, how it differs from East Asia, because you also mentioned the comparison. And then I want to show you what the record is on exports and imports. So that's one thing. Then the other thing I want to show you is what the impact would be of that para-tariff reform that Sri Lanka is considering now. It's truly a pro-poor reform. And finally, I'll go through the labor market implications of these tariff policies and what might happen if they were abolished, or if all these restrictions were at least rolled back. So let me start with the use of trade policies. We look at this in the context of industrial policy. What's industrial policy? Industrial policy is targeted policy. Targeted at a sector or targeted at a firm. You can see in the chart on the left the number of times per year per country that South Asia has used these policies, about twice as much over the last decade as other emerging markets and developing economies. South Asia uses a lot of industrial policies, much more than the average other emerging market. And a lot of them, which you see in the chart in the center, is targeted at manufacturing. So you mentioned this a bit, Dr. Satta already, that this effort to promote manufacturing, that is very visible in this dark blue bar here in the center chart. More than half of the policies in South Asia that are targeted in some form or other, more than half of them are targeted at manufacturing. And then the types of policies we use, which is in the chart on the right, is trade. is trade-related policies. So that's the red bars and the orange bars in the chart on the right here. Yeah, we use way more red and orange. We use way more export and import related policies than the average emerging market and developing economies. And that's really across South Asian countries. Now, Sri Lanka tends to use more import-related policies. Bangladesh tends to use a bit more export-related policies. But overall, the region is an enthusiastic user of trade-related policies. And just keep in mind now this right chart, and I show you what it looks like for East Asia. Look at especially the light blue bars here in the right chart, the subsidies. So South Asia has a lot of red and orange, a lot of trade-related policies. Now this is the same chart for East Asia and Pacific. A lot of subsidies, very few trade-related policies, much fewer than South Asia. So what has been the record of all these trade-related policies? It's a bit difficult to estimate because industry policies, by definition, are targeted, narrowly targeted. So you have a narrowly targeted policy, you need a narrowly targeted outcome. In one area, we can actually estimate it, and that is, thankfully, trade, exactly the type of policies that are South Asia's specialty. And you can see here what happened in a simple event study with data over the last 20 years. What happened to imports in the left chart and what happened to exports in the right chart around the implementation of an industrial policies targeted at restricting imports in the left chart or promoting exports in the right chart. And you can see in the left chart, so T0, around 0, is the date of implementation of this policy. You can see that the import restricting policies in the left chart here, the red ones, did significantly restrict imports. No surprise there, right? The thing that's a bit more concerning is actually the right chart. So there are all these export incentives. The export promoting policies did not significantly promote exports in the chart on the right. It was completely hit and miss. Sometimes they promoted exports, sometimes they didn't. So overall, there is no statistically significant impact on exports. So these policies did not achieve much in terms of, well, they achieved something in terms of imports. They did restrict imports significantly, but they did not achieve what the goal was for many of them, to stimulate exports. Now, maybe I'll come back to this and instead go to what would be the implications on jobs of cutting these import restrictions. So just to remind the audience, Dr. Satta, you mentioned this already, how low the trade openness of South Asia is. So here you see the data for the most recent data where we have actual data, not estimates. For South Asian countries, the trade to GDP ratio in the blue bars, and then you see for for other emerging markets and developing economies, you see the interquartile range in that pink shade and gray shade. And you can see that South Asian trade to GDP ratios, trade openness is among the lowest, at the bottom quartile of emerging markets and developing economies. Same for net FDI flows in the chart on the right, because FDI and trade usually come together. FDI usually happens in trade-related sectors. It's foreign companies trying to exploit the trade advantages they have, the trade differentials. So in part that is because of policy. So here's just a reminder, the interquartile range has disappeared, but all the countries in South Asia except for Bhutan have average tariffs that are above the median, and Sri Lanka and India have them above the bottom quartile of emerging markets and developing economies. Same as FDI restrictions. Now, FDI restrictions we only have for 51 countries, and it's a bit dated, it's from the OECD, but it's a very well-crafted index. You can see the FDI restrictions for India, it's the only country in South Asia, it's available in this data set, are well above the interquartile range of other emerging markets and developing economies. So there's a deliberate policy to restrict trade and to restrict FDI. Who benefits in the labor market? Which jobs benefit from these restrictions? So just to give you a sense, we have in the chart on the left the number of workers that work in each of the sectors after we have ranked the sectors by tariffs. So you can see, for example, about 40% of South Asian workers, 40% or more, are protected by tariffs of 30% or more. Yeah, that's that second big blue bar in the left chart. So that's agriculture. It's a no-brainer. No, much of agriculture is very, very highly protected. Tariffs of 30+%. And that's where the bulk of South Asian employment is, about 40% of workers. Now compare that with the golden diamonds here. This is the average other emerging market and developing economy. In other emerging markets and developing economies, 80% or almost 80% of workers are essentially not protected by tariffs. Tariffs less than 5%. It's very, very different in South Asia. The bulk of employment in South Asia is very highly protected by tariffs. And in other countries, it's the opposite. The bulk of employment is actually not really protected by tariffs. And this bulk of employment that's protected is the bulk of employment that's not growing. It's the least dynamic part of the labor market. That's the point of the chart in the center. For each of our countries where we have data, we calculate the contribution of sectors to employment growth basically over the last decade, since 2010. And we rank sectors we put sectors into buckets. So there's one dark blue bucket with tariffs that essentially no tariffs, no less than 5%, kind of 5% being the global average. Then there is a bucket of sectors that are protected by tariffs somewhere between 5 and 20%. And then there's a group of tariffs, the golden bars here in the center, the orange bars, that are protected by tariffs of more than 20%. So that includes all of agriculture, for example, in South Asia, most of agriculture. And you can see that in the most protected sectors, actually in most of South Asia, detracted from employment growth. They reduced employment growth. They were shrinking their employment, the most protected sectors. Yeah, so you see in India and Sri Lanka and South Asia as a whole, the negative bar, and Bangladesh is barely visible, so it didn't really add to employment growth. The sectors that really generated employment growth, 3/4 of employment growth in South Asia, were the unprotected sectors, the dark blue bars. What type of workers are in these most protected sectors? That's the chart on the right. We run a probate regression to test the probability of a worker being under 30 or being high skilled if the tariff is higher, tariff protection of that sector is higher. And you can see that the more protective the sectors with the workers that are in sectors with higher tariffs, 1 percentage point here, are significantly less likely to be young and less likely to be high skilled. So what these tariffs in South Asia are protecting is a stagnant part of the labor market that is low skilled and is really for older workers. It's a generational shift that is being protected, a generational difference that's being protected by these tariffs. The flip side of this tariff protection is a tariff obstacle. Yeah, so the tariff protection for one sector is actually a higher input price for another sector. And that's what we get at with this slide. So through the input-output matrices, we can then trace what these high tariffs mean for inputs of all the other sectors. Here in the chart on the left, for example, agriculture, industry, and services. You can see for South Asia, the blue bars, all of our sectors face higher input tariffs on inputs, which is exactly what you mentioned, Dr. Satta. Higher input tariffs, twice as high, 2 or 3 times as high the input tariffs of the average emerging market, other emerging market and developing economy. So these sectors which policymakers think of as protection are actually a shackle. They're a burden because they raise input costs by 3 times. So it's no surprise then that it's very difficult to compete in export markets if you pay so much for your inputs. And that's especially binding for industry, manufacturing. Services, a lot of the inputs are labor, skilled labor. unskilled labor. So it's not that big a deal if your other inputs are very expensive, the goods inputs. No? Agriculture, there is some substitution between labor and other inputs. So it's damaging, but not as damaging. The place where it's really damaging is industry, and especially manufacturing, because there is very little room for substitution between these imported inputs and the labor input or other inputs. So it's really a hobbling competitiveness, these high tariffs. It's hobbling competitiveness, export competitiveness, especially in the manufacturing industry. And then it's no surprise that all these export promotion policies that we saw in this previous light blue chart, in the previous section, it's no surprise that it didn't have much impact because they're being hobbled on the input side. Now, the people, so the chart on the left shows you the sectors, the chart in the center shows you the people in the sectors. What are the typical people in these sectors that are being most hobbled by tariffs, on imported inputs? Well, it's significantly more likely to be the young and significantly more likely to be the high skilled that are hobbled, that are being constrained. The jobs in these sectors are being constrained by these input tariffs. If there were now trade reform, we have modeled what would be the impact of trade reform on labor markets. And there we have a really important message, which we try to capture in this very simple chart on the right. So we run a general equilibrium model, very run-of-the-mill standard general equilibrium model. Say we halve the gap between South Asia's input costs and everyone else's input cost. What would happen to GDP? Yeah, to real GDP. That's what the chart on the right gives you, the impact on real GDP. The blue bar is very standard. Yeah, it would raise real GDP by more than a percentage point. Very standard result. This is kind of in line with what the same kind of model finds for the impact of NAFTA on Mexico's real GDP. That's very standard result. So if all these import restrictions were suddenly removed, this would be GDP growth enhancing, better jobs. Not necessarily more jobs, but better jobs. But of course, there is always the concern of the disruption this causes. The labor market losses that this causes, this job losses that this causes in specific sectors that are shrinking because of this trade reform. This trade reform is an asymmetric shock. Yeah, because some tariffs would come down more than others. You would have all of them. Some would come down more than others. And asymmetric shocks cause reallocation. No? That's how you generate the productivity gains and the real GDP growth gains, because resources reallocate. Capital, but also labor reallocates. And if labor doesn't reallocate, you don't get the GDP impact. And that's where policy becomes important. If policy prevents labor from reallocating, it really constrains the real GDP impact. If policy, however, so if this trade policy reform is complemented by other reforms that reduce the obstacles to reallocating workers, you can double the real GDP impact. And that's the difference between the blue bar, which is just the tariff reform, and the red bar, which is trade reform, the tariff reform, or import cost cut, plus a very modest labor market reform. It's a labor market reform. No, actually, labor market is the wrong word. It's a reform that reduces the mobility cost of workers by just 5%. It's not a big reduction in moving cost. Even a small reduction in moving cost can increase the reallocation, the speed at which workers can reallocate and actually take advantage of this trade reform to move to better jobs, expanding industries, and out of the shrinking industries. And I deliberately say it's not just a labor market reform in the narrow sense. The kind of reform that imposes mobility costs or reduces mobility costs is just as much rental markets, for example, housing markets, land markets, anything that makes it easier for workers to move, a new metro system, better road, easier roads, so people can live in one place and work in another place. Anything that makes it easier for workers to reallocate So if you have the trade reform, which causes this asymmetric shock and creates some shrinking sectors and some expanding sectors, if you complement that trade reform with the other things, other reforms that make it easier for workers to move, you can get a really big bang improvement in labor markets and prosperity. Now, we would love to have shown this in the literature, but the literature actually, surprisingly, focuses entirely on identification, causal identification. And the way causal identification is done is by distinguishing between affected workers and unaffected workers. But there is really only one paper that looks at the aggregate impact of big trade reforms. So instead, since we can't rely on the literature, what we try to get at is what would be the impact on aggregate employment of a big trade reform. And that's what we had to do with an event study then, in the chart on the left. So we identified about 122, we took 122 countries, and we identified all the periods in which tariffs were cut, average unweighted tariffs were cut in the top decile. So all the 1/10 of country year episodes in which tariffs fell by most, the top 1/10 of biggest tariff reductions, but not just 1 year, but also 5 years. So we deliberately wanted to get at the events that reduced tariffs for 5 years, for a long time, that stuck, that weren't immediately reversed. And then in the local projections model, we simply traced out what happened to employment, aggregate employment, deliberately. So you can see that in these episodes, after a couple of years, aggregate employment rose statistically significantly. Now, these episodes were usually not just tariff reforms. They usually came with macro stabilization packages. These are big, transformative moments. And look at what happened to employment. It increased significantly after a couple of years. Initially, there was some uncertainty, but after a couple of years, significant increases. And these increases, and that's where we can then return to the literature, which is what we have in the center chart here, a meta-regression analysis actually of the probability of this vast literature showing that the skilled benefited and the young benefited from trade liberalizing reforms. I mean, significantly, basically the bottom line is that the literature overwhelmingly shows that during big reform events, the skilled workers and the young workers benefited disproportionately. Basically, the audience in this room. Then, so one counter argument you often hear about trade reform is, well, then we have revenue losses. We simply can't afford it. That's why we took the same event study, the same events as in the chart on the left, and we looked at what happens to revenues in these same episodes as we have in the employment chart on the left. And look at the chart on the right, you see the revenue impact. Basically, total revenues rose within the 5-year period of these big reforms. Total revenue rose. They didn't fall. Yes, trade reforms, trade-related revenues did fall by a tiny amount, but the non-trade related revenues rose so much that it was statistically significant, and that total revenues also statistically significantly rose. So yes, trade-related revenues will fall if you cut tariffs, obviously, no, that's almost an accounting identity. But it's the rest of the economy that benefits so much, both in terms of employment and in terms of revenues, that you see an overall revenue increase. Now, but let me go back to a reform that may actually happen in Sri Lanka in particular. See this chart on the right? It shows you the import duties for Sri Lanka. On average, 19%. And what they're now considering, the government is considering, is removing the red and the orange in the chart on the right. So the PAL and the cess. That would be a big reduction. That would be a 9 percentage point reduction out of the 19% of import duties right now. And we have estimated what that would mean for households. This is truly a pro-poor reform. Actually, let me show you why. Let me show you, because you can see it so nicely here in the chart on the right. See, the biggest red and orange is actually in processed food and beverages. And who has the biggest share in their consumption baskets in processed food and beverages? It's the lowest, poorest quintile of households. And that's exactly what we see in the chart here on the right. This chart on the right looks at models the real income effects of this para-tariff reform that the authorities are currently considering on the poorest quintile of households and the richest quintile of households. We also distinguish between rural and urban, but this is not the big difference here. In Sri Lanka, the big difference is between the poorest and the richest. This is truly a pro-poor reform because it would cut the tariffs most on exactly the type of goods that the poorest households consume more than others. And I think this is a bit complicated, so I'd be happy to go back to it, but let me close within my allocated time. So how effective, South Asia uses policies, trade-related policies, really enthusiastically. But their record is quite mixed. So import restrictions have restricted imports. It's much harder to get exports to take off. And perhaps this is in part because the current tariffs are really protecting the least dynamic parts of the economy, including the least dynamic parts of the labor market. They are hobbling the most dynamic part. Well, okay, they're hobbling manufacturing, which was actually the target of a lot of the policies. They're really hobbling manufacturing by raising input cost for manufacturing. A tariff reform could significantly raise employment, aggregate employment, because that's what the historical record shows elsewhere and at other times. It could significantly raise employment, especially for the skilled and the more skilled and the younger workers, without doing much damage to revenues. But if there is a concern about the impact of tariff reform on the economy, then the way to mitigate that impact is to make reallocation easier, to make it easier for workers to move, with all sorts of complementary ancillary reforms that go way beyond trade, that just make it easier to move. And Bangladesh also has very high para-tariffs, just like Sri Lanka. And if this para-tariff reform that the Sri Lankan authorities are currently considering is likely to have, would be clearly pro-poor. It would benefit all households, but it would benefit the poorest quintiles of households disproportionately. And let me end with a bit of advertising. So this is our report, and I invite you to take the QR code and download the report, where you can see much more, especially on the Sri Lankan reform and the sectoral impact it also has. And also I'm done just in time, and also some of the impact of the India-EU agreement, India-UK agreements. And with that, I hand back to you, Dr. Sattar. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Francisca. Thank you very much. Big hands for Dr. Francisca, not just bringing us this issue of trade and tariff reforms, but bringing a new dimension. I've been talking about how tariff cuts, and particularly these para-tariffs reduction, have impact on employment and income distribution. You're talking about para-tariffs reduction, helping or promoting the low-income workers, low-skilled workers. They will be getting the benefit, particularly when you have comparative advantage, facilitating strategy of exports or manufacturing development. You expect that labor-intensive sectors get the benefit of real wage increases. That's what the theory says. But thank you very much for bringing this aspect of tariff reforms and the employment effects, and particularly the protection, tariff protection as it exists now, is protecting the section of workers who are not dynamic. So, and I think we distinguished panelists will, I would like them to make some comments on that particular, very, I mean, that's going to be a very exciting discussion, I think. Okay. All right, so just we can now proceed. I think our organizers tell me that Professor Anirudh Singham from India, I have to, he is the Professor and Department Chair, Economics and Policy, S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research. He would like to make a small presentation within his given time of 10 minutes, I guess. So Professor Anirudh Singhal. He's also online.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Salim, and the entire team at SANM. It's an honor and a privilege to be a part of this setup. I will just share my slides if you can give me a minute. Yeah, so just give me 1 second. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes, excellent. Okay, so I'm just going to go full screen. I hope you can still see my slides.
Yes, yes, we can see.
Okay, wonderful. So I think, what I'm going to do is, given the current geopolitical environment, what I thought I would do is present some findings from recent research on different topics, which basically talk about different options for countries to navigate the current trade policy uncertainty. So let me start. I have 10 minutes, so let me put these ideas across to you. So the first is the role of informal networks. So there is research that I've been doing where I look at whether countries that are a part of informal networks like the Commonwealth and the Francophonie, and of course the Commonwealth includes a lot of countries of South Asia, whether these countries that are part of the Commonwealth or the Francophonie tend to trade more within these groups every time there is a spike in trade policy uncertainty. And this is what I'm showing you in the coefficient plot that you see here. And especially if you look at years 2016 to 2019, those are also years where there was a considerable spike in trade policy uncertainty. And clearly what this chart shows is that every time there are crises, countries tend to fall back on, shared culture or shared linguistics that basically provide the comfort or the salience of relational contracting, which provides resilience during these crises. So clearly one option for countries, including those in South Asia, to navigate trade policy uncertainty, and there is evidence for this, is that you end up trading a lot more within informal networks. And that is probably one option that is available to them. The next, and this is quite interesting, aid for trade still works. This is a very encouraging sign. What I have here on the slide is the impact of aid for trade on donors' bilateral imports for different manufacturing sectors. So these are basically, we are not looking at donors' exports to the recipient, but we're actually looking at recipients' exports to the donor, right? This is on the basis of a structural gravity model, which was estimated from 2010 to 22. And what is encouraging is that across a spate of manufacturing sectors, you've got textiles, you've got chemicals, rubbers and plastics, non-metallic minerals, electrical equipment, transport equipment, and miscellaneous products. Across these sectors, aid for trade actually enhances donors' bilateral imports from the recipient, right? And since a lot of the low-income economies tend to be AFT recipients, this is a very encouraging finding. So, this is the other thing that countries could do to navigate trade policy uncertainty is basically to engage the international community and to keep this aid for trade flowing. This does seem to work. The next one, and this actually corroborates Francisca's slides as well, unilateral reforms matter, and in fact, they matter a lot. So what this table does is it basically summarizes the impact of potential policy options that India would have to basically not protect, but to basically respond to the impact of reciprocal tariffs. And what I did is I used the GEPPML estimator to look at the impact of different policy options or scenarios on India's manufacturing exports over the period 2016-2019 using a panel data set of manufacturing exports. The four scenarios considered were that India signed trade agreements with the EU, US, and the UK. The second scenario was looking at additional trade agreements between India and Canada, Chile, Israel, New Zealand, Peru, members of COMESA, SACU, and so on. The third scenario was that India unilaterally liberalizes tariffs by about 10%. And the fourth scenario was a 10% improvement in business climate. And lo and behold, the biggest bang from the buck actually comes from improvements in business climate. And I did a bunch of robustness checks to confirm this, but really there is a 142% increase, or there would be a 142% increase in the value of India's manufacturing exports over this time period if there was as much as, you know, a 10% improvement in the business climate. And you know, this also dwarfs the impact of other policy options, including, you know, signing trade agreements or reducing tariffs unilaterally, right? So clearly, business climate improvements, making it easy for businesses. That also means that there is a lot of gains, there are a lot of gains to be had from liberalizing barriers to services trade. What these scatter plots show is basically the relationship between gravity predicted import flows on the y-axis, averaged over 2000-2019, and on the x-axis, the value of the services trade restrictiveness index for these countries 2020 onwards to mitigate endogeneity-related concerns. And you see from both these scatter plots, one for traditional services on the left and for modern services or digital services on the right, that the larger the barriers, the less are the trade flows. So clearly, you know, countries are going to benefit a lot from reducing and streamlining unnecessary regulation in services. And that also complements the results that you saw for India, for instance. And clearly, these are some of the options that countries could pursue to navigate the recent trade policy uncertainty. Thank you all. That's all from me.
Thank you, Dr. Anirudh Shingal. This is, of course, a new dimension to our discussion. It's about the global uncertainty that has arisen from several developments like the reciprocal tariffs and the impacts. So I think we can now go back to our main keynote presentation and I hope you're all comfortable with the shocks that we just had, and that we'll resume discussions. We still have two very distinguished panelists. Professor Mustafizur Rahman, the Distinguished Fellow of Center for Policy Dialogue. And we have Dr. Rajan Krishnapanta from Nepal. He's the director, Nepal Rashtra Bank, which is the central bank of Nepal. Okay. But before... Colombo, Sri Lanka. Just to trigger and add some excitement to the panel discussion, I just couldn't resist the temptation of taking just the one point out of Dr. Francisca's presentation, keynote presentation, and because she has brought up the idea that, these tariff reduction, it's not just about tariff reduction that loses revenue. She showed pretty much, and this is one stumbling block that policy makers always face, which is that how are you going to, in the case of Bangladesh, tariffs are so high that when you talk of reducing tariffs as a part of reform, the first item of discussion is, where is the revenue going to come from? So you have pointed out that no, on the trade taxes, the trade tax revenue, there might be losses, but the losses are more than recovered by increase in activities in the non-trade activities. That means the overall economy gets a boost from the trade reforms and generates revenue that more than compensates for those losses from trade taxes. So that is a point that I hope our panelists will bring in. So may I now invite Dr. Mustafizur Rahman. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Zaidi Bhai. It's an honor to be on the same panel with you. Zaidi Bhai has been our guru for many, many years. When we were young, we used to look up to Zaidi Bhai for any trade-related issues. So thank you very much. And thank you, Selim and Sanem. Congratulations. 9th consecutive conferences of excellence. So, and this is also an opportunity to hear from other colleagues. Now, today's, I think, session theme is very important. And Francisca, thank you very much. We always look up to the South Asia Economic Update, and we want to learn new things from the update. And this time also, we have a lot of insights. I think what you have said with regard to the trade reforms and the benefits and the resource allocation to more efficient sectors that will employ young people, and that, as Zaidi Bhai just mentioned, that if trade reforms are there, one of the contentious issues is the revenues, but overall the revenues increase, even though the customs duties and trade-related import duties may decrease. So all these are very well taken. When we were young, there was a talk that economists, if two economists are there, there are three opinions, but there is only one theory where all economists tend to agree, and that is the theory of comparative advantage. So I think that falls in line with what you have said. Now, my problem with this is that we are talking about trade, and it's either import or export, and it requires two to tango. So it's we as importer and exporters, but on the other side, when we are importing, there is an exporter on the other side. And even when we are exporting, there is an importer on the other side. So when we talk about what are the benefits, what are the revenue considerations, whether the agriculture, it will create jobs, etc., etc., we will also have to think what my partner is pursuing. I cannot detach whether, whether I take trade reforms and that will bring me benefit or not without thinking of what my partner is doing. Now, for example, right at this moment when we are talking and we are talking about, for example, we should reduce our, import duties, para tariffs, agricultural, duties on agricultural imports. But at the same time, I also know that the United States provides $10 billion, and in 2020, it was in fact $25 billion in agricultural subsidy, farm subsidy. Now, the prices that I get and my agricultural products are competing with those imported products, and those products are subsidized products. So I am being asked to reduce my tariff, but I am not talking about the country from which I am importing, what policies they are pursuing. European Union, last year it paid about $65 billion under the Common Agricultural Policy support of the European Union. And they are subsidizing the agricultural products and they are exporting to our countries. So can we really decouple what my partner countries are doing and just think about whether I am pursuing trade liberalization, whether I am reducing protections, etc., etc.? Will it be fair? As we speak now, the United States have imposed reciprocal tariff on almost all the countries. On Bangladesh, 37% reciprocal tariff, and we have just signed an agreement on reciprocal trade with the United States, where we are asked to reduce import duties on United States imports, the products that we are importing, almost to zero level within the next 10 years. 4,500 commodities immediately zero tariff access, and the rest 3,000 over the next 5 to 10 years. And our duty in the United States, which is already very high at 16% import weighted average, added to that will be another 19%. So 35% duty our export will be facing, and we are asked to provide zero tariff. Can we discuss any trade related issues without referring to what is happening in my partner country, what policies they are pursuing? Last year, import duties on Bangladesh's exports to the United States was $1,220 million. After this 35% duty, instead of the 16% duty that was in place, it will be almost $3 billion of import duties. So, theory is fine, and as part of unilateral policies, we may talk about what policies we should pursue, what benefits it can do, but in practice, if we don't address the policies pursued by my partner, because as I was telling, it is trade, it's just not domestic, there is another partner whose policies will impinge and impact on what you do or not do. Ready-made garments. Our ready-made garments, obviously the bonded warehouse facilities that remove the anti-export bias for this sector, and we have benefited from zero tariff imports. That's fine. But at the same time, we also provided 25% cash compensation scheme, subsidies, in order for that sector to come to where it is here. So it was a hybrid. On the one hand, we were providing zero tariff to the imported inputs, which is trade liberalization. On the other hand, we were also supporting with subsidies, which is some sort of a protectionist policy. So that worked, and that's why we are now the second largest exporter in the ready-made garments. And I remember that in the 1990s, we used to debate with the World Bank whether Bangladesh would ever have a backward linkage, because we were importing cotton, we don't produce cotton. And the policy prescription was that you always remain cutting and making, C&M, and you should not pursue backward linkage. Today, as we speak, in our knitwear, which provides 52% of our export, it is cotton up. We have very strong backward linkage in knitwear. Spinning, weaving, ready-made garmenting, backward linkage. And why that is there? Because we have provided support. So now 55% of our ready-made garments, we have domestic value addition. So I don't disagree with what it should be, but if I look at from Bangladesh lens, this is what is really the reality. Now going forward, obviously, para-tariffs, we should rationalize, and Bangladesh is going to be graduating from the LDCs on 24th of November 2026, and if we can defer another 3 years, but as part of the LDC graduation, we will have to come out of these para-tariffs, we will have to come out of some of the direct subsidies. But there are other policy supports which have been given under the various WTO agreements, special and differential treatment, precisely because the world is not a level playing field. Precisely because, average tariff in European Union is 2 to 3%, but the only product that I have proven competitive advantage faces 12% duty. The average duty in United States is 3% average import duty. But the one that I export, average duty is 15%. So for me, that is the market access. 1 minute, okay. So, okay, I will conclude. My conclusion is that, yes, I don't disagree that if the world was a level playing field, if we didn't face the policies that are being pursued by the markets that where we go and by the markets from where we procure our inputs, I would have agreed with that. But if we don't talk about that side and just talk about that unilateral reforms matter, I wouldn't agree with that if I'm in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafiz. I also agree that the world does not give us a level playing field. Although we have this MFN system of the multilateral World Trade Order, and all of us know that it's now in tatters, so to say. So, but coming back to Dr. Francisca's presentation, I have one more interesting finding from your presentation, which is about, you talked about protection for imports, and on the other hand, you talked about export subsidies. And on that note, I also want to just add something that is not in the presentation. You didn't look at Bangladesh tariffs. Half of Bangladesh's tariff protection comes from the para-tariffs. So this is a remarkable situation. And Sri Lanka has those cesses, which they are now trying to reform and reduce. But interestingly, what is going on is, in spite of the tariff protection to import substituting manufacturing sector, the subsidies that go on exports are no match to the indirect subsidy that comes from protective tariffs. That's it's an enigma, and it needs some policy guidance. I mean, it raises for Bangladesh a very difficult problem of, what we have described as anti-export bias of these protection policies. So I noticed that one of your charts on industrial policy does look at how much of imports are being protected and how much of exports receiving subsidies. So maybe there's some, talking point here for the discussion later. Our next panelist, I'd rather give Dr. Rajan Krishna Panta, Director of the Central Bank of Nepal, to make his remarks within 10 minutes if possible, and then we'll go to our online panelist.
Thank you, Chair Dr. Jayadi Sattar, Dr. Francisca Onsorg, Chief Economist, South Asia Region, the World Bank, esteemed panelists, friends and colleagues. At the outset, I would like to thank Sanim and especially Professor Salim Rayyan for providing this opportunity as a panelist in this exciting conference. Please allow me to read out the speech that I prepared. So, I would like to step back a little bit because the theme of our session is trade and macroeconomic challenges in South Asia, and take a broad step about the relationship between trade, macroeconomic fragility, and evolving role of policy in South Asia. So South Asia today stands at a critical juncture, one that is not defined by lack of growth, but by the growing tension between growth and structural transformation. On the surface, the region appears remarkably resilient. It remains among the fastest growing parts of the global economy, yet beneath this performance lies a structural paradox that deserves a far greater attention. Despite accounting for nearly a quarter of the world's population, South Asia contributes less than 5% of global trade. Even more strikingly, trade within the region itself remains at roughly 5% of total trade. This is not a simple trade statistic. It is a reflection of a deep structural reality. South Asia remains one of the least economically integrated regions in the world. And my central proposition is this: South Asia's macroeconomic vulnerabilities and state underperformance are not separate problems. They are manifestation of the same underlying structural constraint. Let me begin by situating this discussion in the current global context. The global economy is undergoing a profound transformation. We are moving away from an era of hyperglobalization towards a more fragmented and uncertain system. Trade is increasingly shaped not only by comparative or competitive advantage, but by geopolitical considerations, supply chains resilience, and national security concerns. At the same time, we are witnessing persistent inflationary pressures driven by supply shocks, tight global financial conditions, increased volatility in capital flows, and intensifying climate risks. This combination has radically transformed the external environment facing emerging and developing economies. For South Asia, this shift has two important implications. First, integration into global value chains is no longer automatic. It must be actively enabled. Second, the cost of macroeconomic instability has increased significantly. In a world of tight financial conditions, even small imbalances can trigger disproportionate adjustments. To understand South Asia's position in the evolving landscape, we must examine the interaction between trade and macroeconomics. In theory, open economies adjust to external shocks through price mechanisms, particularly exchange rates. But this mechanism relies on a critical assumption that trade is responsive to price signals. In South Asia, this assumption is weak. Trade costs are high, export bases are narrow, and production systems do not have flexibility. As a result, exchange rate depreciation does not lead to a strong export response. That means the export elasticity is quite low in the region. Instead, it raises import prices, fuels inflation, and forces adjustment through contraction via tight monetary policy, reduced imports, and slower growth. This creates a structural dynamic that is both inefficient and unstable. A high trade cost, high macro volatility equilibrium. Trade frictions weaken adjustment mechanisms, and macroeconomic instability discourages trade integration. The result is a cycle that is difficult to break. Let me now turn to the specific trade constraints that underpin this dynamic. First, Trade costs in South Asia are exceptionally high, estimated at around 130% of tariff equivalent terms. These costs are driven not only by tariffs, but also by a complicated network of non-tariff barriers, para-tariffs that we discussed earlier, logistical inefficiencies, and regulatory frictions. Firms operating in the region face lengthy custom procedures, multiple and often redundant inspections, inconsistent application of standards, and significant uncertainty in global regulatory enforcement. These frictions raise cost, reduce competitiveness, and discourage firms from participating in international trade. Second, the region's failure to realize its intra-regional trade potential is particularly striking. Actual trade within South Asia is estimated at around $23 billion, whereas the potential exceeds 67 billions. This gap reflects not geography, but policy. In gravity model terms, the region exhibits a large border effect, where policy-induced barriers substantially suppress trade flows between neighboring countries. Third, export structures remain highly concentrated. Bangladesh and Pakistan rely heavily on textiles and garments, Sri Lanka on tea, garments and tourism, Nepal on narrow export base supported by remittances, and even India, while more diversified, has yet to fully realize its manufacturing export potential. This concentration increases vulnerability to external shocks and limits the ability of the region to benefit from global supply chains configuration. Fourth, logistics and connectivity constraints remain binding, particularly for landlocked economies. For countries like Nepal, access to global markets depends critically on transit arrangements and infrastructure in neighboring countries. This introduces an additional layer of uncertainty, raising the cost of trade and discouraging investment in tradable sectors. These trade challenges are strongly intertwined with macroeconomic vulnerabilities. The region is characterized by persistent current account pressures driven by import dependence and limited export diversification. Imports of energy, capital goods, and intermediate inputs remain high, while exports growth is constrained. External financing plays a key role in sustaining this imbalance. Remittances in particular provide a significant source of foreign exchange and support domestic consumption.
One more minute, please.
1 minute? Okay. However, they introduce structural distortions, sustained inflows, and appreciate real exchange rate, weaken export competitiveness, and reduce incentives for structural reforms. So I'd like to skip the central bank's part and directly go to the what should be done, okay? So this brings me to the question of what needs to be done. First, the region must prioritize trade facilitation over tariff reduction. The largest gains are likely to come from reducing the real cost of trading through improvements in customs procedures, logistics, and regulatory harmonization. Second, regional integration must become operational. Rather than broad agreements, the focus should be on specific trade corridors with clear commitments on transit infrastructures and procedures. Third, export competitiveness must be strengthened by improving access to inputs, infrastructures, and markets. This requires a shift from protection to productivity. Fourth, macroeconomic and trade policy must be aligned. Trade reform cannot succeed in an environment of macroeconomic instability, and macroeconomic stabilization cannot be sustained without stronger trade performance. Fifth, central banks must continue to strengthen their frameworks, enhancing credibility, improving communication, and adapting to evolving challenges. Finally, climate resilience must be integrated into economic strategy, ensuring that infrastructures and supply chains remain robust in the face of increasing shocks. So let me conclude. South Asia's challenge is not lack of growth, it's a lack of transformation. The region has already shown its ability to grow, but it has yet to lay the structural foundations for sustained, resilient prosperity. In a world of increasingly uncertainty and fragmentation, the cost of inaction is rising. The region cannot afford to remain under-integrated and vulnerable. The opportunity, however, is equally clear. With the right policies, South Asia can leverage its scale, location, and demographic advantage to become a more dynamic and integrated part of the global economy. But this will require a shift in perspective from viewing trade and macroeconomics as separate domains to recognizing them as fundamentally interconnected. Ultimately, the question is not whether South Asia can grow, it already does. The question is whether it can translate growth into resilience, integration, and long-term prosperity. And that will depend on the options we choose today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. Thank you for your insights and perspectives on the transformation that is taking place. I would call it disruption rather than transformation, but it's okay. And but I have some trouble in accepting the idea that we should encourage trade facilitation over tariff reduction or reform, because the high tariffs are, an obstruction to trade facilitation. So the two has to go together. Okay, so that brings us to our last distinguished panelist, Dr. Srimal Abiratne, Emeritus Professor of Economics, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. Professor Abiratne, the floor is yours. And 10 minutes, please, if you. Oh, you're muted. Could you please unmute?
It's unmuted.
Okay.
I can hear you. Online, we can hear you.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Right. Thank you. I could not agree more with you about your remarks at the introduction about Sri Lanka, as well as about the trade and macroeconomic challenges that South Asia has faced with. In fact, we should be getting ready now to celebrate in Sri Lanka 50 years of trade liberalization next year. But what is striking me is the trade performance during this 50-year time period. And exports have grown less than $15 billion a year, and exports of goods and services about 20 billion a year, and which is quite strange. Probably Sri Lanka is one of the few countries in the world which have reported such poor export performance, having such a long time experience in export-oriented trade policy reforms. I'm going to outline, given the 10 minutes for me, I'm going to outline the current situation of the country. As you all know, the Sri Lanka has faced with a series of shocks during the last couple of years, starting from COVID pandemic. And then we also had a debt repayment suspension, led to an economic crisis in 2022. And then another cyclone impact. So having said all these things, and I would say that when you visit Sri Lanka, when you visit Colombo, you don't see on the surface any crisis situation here, but underneath, poverty levels have increased to millions, and businesses have collapsed, and there are a lot of reconstruction and recovery to be done. During the last 3 years or so, we have achieved remarkable progress in economic recovery from the crisis situation. And also we have achieved debt sustainable progress, which we need to complete debt repayment, to start debt repayment period in 2028. But we are right now struggling between trade and macroeconomic challenges at the moment, I would say. The reason is trade is fundamental to a lot of changes that we anticipate and also answer to the current problems. The stability that we have achieved cannot be sustained without trade and growth. The poverty levels that have increased cannot be reduced without creating jobs, creating income generating opportunities for the people. Millions now remain below the poverty lines, and that all requires trade and growth. And trade is also fundamentally important to meet our debt obligations starting from 2028. Although our stability indicators shows a remarkable improvement, where I have some disappointments is again in the external finance position, including the reserve position. Reserve position has increased, improved, but below the IMF targets. So this is where the problem is right now, but we need to take that quite seriously. So this theme of this panel discussion is rightly fit into to our Sri Lankan situation right at the moment. Trade reforms is fundamentally important, as I said, and as Francisca also elaborated in her presentation. However, we are now comfortable, seems to be quite comfortable with rising tourism revenue as well as rising remittances. But tourism, like the cherry on the cake, and you can't say that it's a good cake and we have baked it nicely by looking at the cherry. It's a sensitive industry, sensitive to the world as well as domestic health conditions, security conditions, and so on. So we cannot depend on tourism, and I don't think there are countries which have depended on tourism. It may supplement income, foreign income. The second one is remittances, and last year Sri Lanka has recorded highest remittance inflow in the history, and we celebrated that as well. I don't think it is a sign of prosperity. I think it is a sign of the problem that we have right underneath because of the lack of trade reforms. So, however, the problem is now because of these two rising income flows, foreign exchange inflows, we are seems to be comfortable with that and to not to talk that much about trade reforms. Apparently, with the recommendation of the IMF, and we are focusing on removing the para tariff, probably that have got delayed because of the last year, end of last year, the cyclone issues. But however, I hope that it would come soon, which is going to be very important for us. And also, if you look at our labor force data, very low unemployment, less than 4% according to latest labor force estimate. Less than, I think as I remember, it is 3.8% unemployment rate. And if anybody look at that rate, and they would be surprised to see that, okay, having undergone with so many crises and faced with so many Excel shocks and having millions under below the poverty line, and how come that Sri Lanka is having such a low poverty, low unemployment rates? Our labor force is 8.5 million. This is a small country. Also, our dependency ratio is more than 50% as an aging society. But if you look at the structural rigidities in our employment composition, such as the 2.2 million people out of that 8.5 million people are trapped in domestic agriculture sector. That means more than actually 25% of the labor force. Also, when you look at the poverty,
One more minute, please.
More than 80% of our poor lives in the rural agriculture sector. In fact, the latest population census also report that 78% of our population, there are some other issues as well, such as the demarcation issues. But however, 78% 0.5% of our population live in the rural sector, which is actually hailed by many and thinking that our people prefer rural setting more than urban setting. But the problem is, again, lack of urbanization, lack of industrialization, and lack of trade reforms. And so with those things, actually large part of our the labor force is also stuck in less rewarding, unproductive categories of industries, including agriculture, domestic agriculture sector, and also 1 million, over 1 million young people drive tuk-tuks in the, in the cities, and about 1.5 million people in the public sector, and also 2 million working in the as migrant workers. So with all these things, you can see unemployment rate, low unemployment rate is not a surprise. But however, what is important is more productive employment generation, which will be the answer to many of the current issues. So with that note, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Abe Ritne, for your insights and perspectives. I think, if I understand you, you confirm Dr. Francisca's finding that Sri Lanka's experience and record seems to suggest that reforms, whatever reforms we have so far, did not boost exports. And also, I wish some of our panelists addressed the other point that Dr. Francisca made about imports, that reforms didn't also show any dynamism in imports, particularly import penetration in these economies. So there's a dual problem. Imports didn't grow, exports were not boosted by these reforms. So that's the problem. I wish some of our panelists also addressed that very critical point raised in Dr. Francisca's research, which is about the allocation of labor, the friction in the labor market, lack of labor mobility, which prevented labor from moving from the less dynamic sectors to the more dynamic sectors once you had these tariff reforms, the trade reforms. And that could be one of the problems going forward. So I think our policymakers, this is one aspect that policymakers will have to address, the labor market. Rigidities have to be addressed. So that ends our panel discussion. So it's time for our open floor discussion. I hope we have questions that address some of the research findings of the keynote presentation, so that we can have a debate and some critique as well. Okay, Ami Ekta. So one hand, yes, please. Please introduce yourself and raise the question.
Good evening. My name is Iftikhar Ahmed Abir. I am from East West University. My question is for Francisca ma'am. So, little bit of background first of all. I grew up in Chittagong, but my root lies in a rural village called Shondip. So, from my childhood, I have seen people from there to migrate different countries to earn their livelihood, mostly Middle Eastern countries. So, as you said, trade reforms mostly benefit rural households as it opens more export opportunities. So, can it reduce migration from rural households too? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take 3 questions before we, consider responses. Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Zubair Hussain. I'm the program director at SANEM. My question is also for Dr. Francisca. In one of your slides, you mentioned that the tariff cuts benefit the younger skilled workers, where the older unskilled workers are sheltered by the current protections. So don't you think that these risks leaving the vulnerable workers behind? If yes, what are the social protection or upskilling policies should be taken into consideration to avoid leaving vulnerable workers behind? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Padamraj Paneru. I'm from Nepal. I teach economics to graduate students and also undergraduate students. But I love myself to say as a student, right? So I consider me as a student now. And my question is is from that the finding of that last presentation. The question actually it's I just want to have answer from the answer, right? The answer was. The question was, how effective are the South Asia's trade policy? And the answer was, finding was, mixed record, import restriction, restricted imports, export promotion does not boost the trade, export, right? And a few days back, I was like, I'm not a development economist. I'm a very, in a sense, learner of the development economics. And I was reading about the three wave of development in the world economies, particularly during the 1970s, we had a world structuralism, right? That actually focused on the government-led economies, showing the problem of market failure, and that emphasized on the import substitution policies. And then later on in 1990s or 80s, we have we went to the neoliberalism, right? And we have privatization and liberalization, and that opened up the market. And then I was reading a new model that was new structural economics, the coined around 2011 by one of the Chinese economists. Justin Liu. And I found that very interesting, and I was about to talk on it to my student as well, right? And that new structural economics actually focused on the export promotion, but earlier old structuralism that focused on import substitution, right? So the tiger economies, basically they made a huge progress by focusing on export or export promotion, but earlier model, the traditional one was the import substitution. Now my question is, since the finding is saying like the export promotion strategies or policies are not effective, then where should we are supposed to be moving? I mean, what is the good policy strategy for us? Should we move to that new structural economics model? That what the new tiger economies are have benefited from, or should we stick to the neoliberalism? As we said, this is Washington consensus, and there is a saying like new structural economics. They say that we have a lost decade of 1990s to till now from the export we could not promote our export from the neoliberalism and all those things. So there is a term like lost decade and all those, right? So I'm quite confused. What should I, share to my student? Whether what particular economic model should we focus on, or should we go back to, or to go to new? Thank you so much.
Three very good questions. I think I will let Dr. Francisca do her best to address them. Dr. Francisca, it's yours.
Thank you very much. There are a few things I want to go back to, actually, even to discussants. For example, Professor Singhal shows something very similar to us. I'm really glad that he shows the same results. Your big bang reform is a 10% improvement in the business climate, which is kind of equivalent to us when we look at these labor mobility reforms. Those reforms have big bang because they're not just asymmetric for one particular, they're less asymmetric, they're cross-country cutting across the whole economy. They benefit everyone, so you get big impacts out of those. Whereas trade tends to benefit, tariff cuts tend to benefit the sectors where tariffs are cut the most. So those reforms are fantastic. And I think of tariff cuts, that goes back to what you said, Dr. Satta. Tariff cuts are the entry point. But these days, they usually come with all sorts of other reforms. Trade facilitation, for example, what Professor Krishna Panta said. This is the trade facilitation. I think it was our Nepali colleague. Trade facilitation is incredibly important, but it'll have an extra oomph if it comes with tariff reform. If you just do trade facilitation by itself, it probably doesn't achieve what it's intended to achieve if it's prohibitively expensive to import. Then one more thing I want to get to Professor Rahman. I sympathize with you. Certainly with all these tariffs, the US has become a less attractive market. Of course, if tariffs are going up in the US, it's just a less attractive market. But the world is big. The world is big, and there is Asia, there is Europe, where tariffs are not rising. In fact, now there are all sorts of agreements being entered in Europe. But I sympathize with you. Here's the sentiment. The one thing on the RMG sector, yes, the RMG sector has long been an example of success because it has zero tariff on inputs. Maybe also because of the subsidies, but I suspect the input costs, the cheap input costs, is a big element. Why can other sectors not benefit from the same? Why can it? So if you think of the WTO, this most favored nation idea, maybe countries can have this most favored sector idea. If the RMG sector benefits, gets this particularly low input cost, why can other sectors not benefit from the same? Why does it need to be preferential treatment for just one sector instead of for the whole economy? So that's just a thought. We haven't modeled what it would be the impact.
Sure.
Now to the questions. And the remittances, because this is something that came up also in the first question. Professor Abiratni, your comment on the remittances. I actually, when we looked at remittances, they can be powerful forms of creating trade and investment. It's true that South Asia has large diasporas, and it's usually considered a problem, but it can also become an asset for South Asian countries. These diasporas are high skilled and they have really good networks. In Vietnam, for example, they have become the spark that spark trade and investment in both directions. So with the right kind of policies, that kind of spark can trigger more interaction. Mr. Hussain, the second question actually raised a really important point that I kind of brushed over and that I think Professor Rahman also pointed to. This idea of leaving the vulnerable behind. Of course, if 40% of your labor force, your workforce, is protected by tariffs of more than 30%, you cannot just abolish these tariffs. Obviously not. It's just way too disruptive. This is the kind of reform that needs to be phased in over a decade. It's decided today in a binding manner and then phased in over a decade. The example I'm thinking of is, for example, pension reform in Europe. Just as politically divisive, potentially leaving many vulnerable behind. The decision was done today, phased in over a decade. But there are things that can be done within that decade or early on too. For example, in-kind benefits. This is one of the suggestions by Professor Muralidharan. The in-kind benefits can be changed into cash benefits. So a lot of the vulnerable agricultural workers especially benefit from fertilizer subsidy, electricity subsidy, water subsidies, all sorts of subsidies, seed subsidies, all sorts of in-kind subsidies. But what can be done is convert these into cash subsidies so those agricultural workers that can move can take the subsidy with them and have a new start elsewhere. Those workers that have no hope of becoming productive in another sector have a protection because you don't want to leave the vulnerable behind. It's a matter of changing the nature of the subsidy rather than cutting it overnight and leaving many, many behind. One note of caution on the third question, because this is something that comes up a lot. The comparison with Korea's export-oriented industrial policies, very much export promotion, and China's model of, actually, if you look at that chart, it's less export trade related, it's more like subsidies for specific industries. But so when did Korea implement these policies? It implemented them in the 60s and 70s. It bet on exports when the whole world was betting on import substitution. And it bet on exports at a time where, just by coincidence, the whole world was opening. All advanced countries were dropping their trade barriers. So yes, it was good policy. It was also good luck. This is going to be much harder today, these export promotion policies. It'll need much more domestic efforts too these days, because there's just not this trade opening wave that's happening anymore. China also, as an example, is a difficult example. And that's a point made in our East Asia update. Yes, it's always cited, there's a lot of evidence also, lots of case studies and beautiful RCTs that show that particular policies boosted exports. For example, the shipbuilding. Within 20 years, it become the half of global shipbuilding. It hasn't been done in China. What's underrated there is the cost. There's this one study by Barwick et al. That shows that for every single type of subsidy, they got some 10 or 15 of them, for every one of them, the cost was higher than the benefit. There are very few countries in the world that can afford this kind of inefficiency, not ineffectiveness. Effective it was, but it was very inefficient, extremely costly. I'm not sure this is a good example for any of the South Asian countries. And with that, back to you, Professor Satta.
Thank you very much for very elaborate responses. More questions, please? And you can also raise question for the distinguished panelists. Please. Question, David.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Barun from India, so currently working at International Food Policy Research Institute. And really insightful presentation from Dr. Francisca, and great listening from you. So I want to share one perspective that the entire world experienced different kind of disruption last 5 years, starting from COVID-related logistic disruption, and then there is a conflict, Russia, Ukraine, and now we are also facing that. And all these conflicts, and I think, changing the political discourse in the small economy, like looking at the inward-looking policy, more protectionism, self-sufficiency. So under this situation, how we should react on this tariff reform? So how should we convince the policymakers on this policy reform, tariff policy reform or trade policy reform? Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? This side. Okay.
So yes, I can ask one question. So there is this resurgence of industrial policy because I read just one report that just came out by World Bank, and it said that the original position that the World Bank had in 1993 landmark report on this Asian miracle. So they have now more nuanced view of this industrial policy. So how do we square off this thing with the discussion we have so far, like how to design this industry policy, specifically like in countries like in South Asian region? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing this up, because Dr. Francisca's presentation had a lot of focus on the new industrial policy. All these South Asian countries are following industrial policy. So they have given up the old idea that you don't need an industrial policy. So if I could add to Dr. Rajan's question, you raised the point about reducing one of the strategies of the industrial policy is to reduce tariffs on intermediate goods. We all find that tariffs on intermediate goods in South Asia are very high. Okay, if in the context of Bangladesh, both intermediate goods and finished good tariffs are very high. Now, you suggest that reducing intermediate goods tariffs, improve competitiveness, but there is this the other thing, which is if you reduce intermediate goods tariffs and not reduce tariffs on finished goods, which has been the case in Bangladesh for the last 2 decades, then you are actually raising effective protection So rather than, you're basically promoting import substitution rather than export promotion. So how do you address that part? Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
Doctor.
Yes, thank you, Francisca, for your response. With regard to the industrial policy, now, strategic industrial policy also tells that you have to provide support to specific industries, and that would mean that you provide some protection, and every country is doing that. When US provides farm subsidy, it is providing support to the farm industry. When the European Union provides the cap subsidy, it's supporting particular sector. So shouldn't we allow that to other countries also, that specific industries will need maybe time-bound support and when we talk about trade liberalization, we also have to think about that it is necessary, but it is not sufficient. There has to be other, and you have mentioned about trade facilities, etc. But even trade reforms has to be, the sequencing, the phasing, the pacing of the reforms. That is also very important. So when we talk about reforms, I think that we will also have to keep this in mind with what pace, with what sequence, how it should be phased. So if you would like to comment on that, thank you.
Ar kono proshno ache ekhane? Oh, there are a couple of questions here. Okay. Then আমাদের time শেষ হয়ে আসছে. We can have 10 minutes extra, I hope. Okay.
My question is, my name is Uday Namalgama. I am from Sri Lanka, working in the Ministry of Trade. So my question is, you mentioned about that import tariff reduction is directly affect on tariff revenue of the country, especially in the South Asian country. So this is a very directly affect on the welfare of that country. So as a compensate, we can impose domestic tax on industry. So what's the experience in World Bank, and what are the studies and regarding that? What is the effect on the welfare and overall economic effects?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Another question? I think that should be our last question, given the time constraint.
My name is Shafqat Shafiq from Institute of Health Economics, University of Dhaka. So my question is, in the discussion of trade reforms and trade liberalizations, of course, trade liberalization is a good thing, but as a third world country, shouldn't countries hold to the key sectors of import? Because if we see the only examples of the third world countries, like the Asian tigers, South Korea, Japan, so in the emerging of this economy, they were very protective on the key industries, and they started reform from the other things. And if we also take the example of the shock therapy of the 1990s in the Russia, in the 5 years of the shock therapy, that means the trade rationalization and liberalizations of the whole economy, they had to face hyperinflations and widespread poverty, and the economy was devastated within the only 5 years. So shouldn't the trade liberalizations be doing gradually, protecting the key sectors of the whole economy in which they have the potential to do good?
Thank you. Thank you. I'll let Francisca give some concluding remarks before I take over, and as the agenda says, I'll have another 10 minutes after that, okay? So I'll let Francisca respond to some of the questions and issues raised.
Thank you. Just very briefly, thank you, Dr. Krishna Patnatu, for raising this new industrial policy report. Yes, it says there is more evidence that these industrial policies can sometimes be effective. But the point of the report, it spends many pages on the but. So it says that really to have an effective policy, first you need a big domestic market, otherwise there's really no point. You're constraining yourself to something that is very small instead of embracing the world. No, it's a big domestic market. The other condition is lots of fiscal space. Remember the China example? It's really expensive to do these policies. It's a waste of money often. They're broader policies. And third is to have the capacity, which goes a bit to this question, the last question, the capacity to implement these policies, identify, I mean, ideally you would identify just that sector of the future and you would get it right. Yeah? People forget how many times policies failed. They were costly and they failed. They were gotten wrong and it's really costly. And so capacity matters. And then the report goes into a lot of discussion of the how. How do you implement policy to make sure that you get it right even if these conditions are in place? First, it needs to be very, very transparent. Second, there needs to be monitoring all the time. Is it working? Is it working? If it's not working, cut it. Cut it. That's what China did with the shipbuilding subsidies or shipbuilding support. It gave subsidies to everyone, so it was a free-for-all. Lots of companies entered. Massive excess capacity, and then they culled. They culled. A lot of companies then closed. So it's a very disruptive way of getting the policy outcome that they wanted to dominate, or to have a big shipbuilding industry. Sorry, which links to one of the other things. So how do you convince the policymakers? There are better policies. Why waste money on industrial policy, on these targeted things where so much can go wrong? So in that report, for example, there is, it identifies South Asian countries on the three criteria: fiscal space, capacity, and market size. And it says for most of South Asia, actually, the only thing that is likely to work is industrial parks, industrial zones. Now we know that some industrial zones have been very effective, like for example the Apple factory and the cluster that comes around it. And it happens to be in Tamil Nadu, where there is just a lot of things are working right. And then other industrial zones, including in Bangladesh, had to be abandoned because the public infrastructure couldn't be built around it. So it might be just better to take broad policies, like a broad approach to liberalization and to competitiveness across the board, rather than these targeted things. But I see that Professor Shingal is trying to come in too.
Yeah, thank you, Francisca. So just wanted to make a couple of points there on the broader discussion that we've had. So I completely agree with you on the limitations of industrial policy. And I think, especially if you look at subsidies, for instance, this becomes even more salient in a world where public debts are going up, fiscal sustainability is a problem. So clearly, this inevitably is going to lead to a race to the top, right? And not all countries can participate in that race, and that actually enhances and exacerbates both inequalities and vulnerabilities. The other point I'd like to also make is I think it was very good that you spoke about tariff liberalization in tandem with social protection. There are clear effects of these policies on the labor market. I think there was a time when economists broadly did not discuss these as much as they probably ought to have done, and maybe a lot of the things that have happened since then is an outcome of that. So I think it's good to have that discussion out there in the open. In that context, it's also important to understand that, when we talk about tariff liberalization and social protection, the importance of mobility across regions, the importance of mobility across occupations is important. But at the same time, there is a very nice connect that you have between manufacturing and services. There is this whole complementarity picture, which is not, I think, as well understood or even portrayed in the literature as it ought to be. Normally, when people talk about services and services exports, they're talking about digital services, but there are a lot of traditional sectors like construction and maintenance and repair and transport and logistics, where there's a lot of scope for relatively semi-skilled and unskilled people to move out of low productivity jobs in agriculture and manufacturing and to get viable employment opportunities. And I think this is something that people need to focus on as well.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think at the end of the day, we really had a very stimulating, very exciting, very rich presentation as well as the discussions, the questions. I have a job of trying to assimilate all of those things, but that is an impossible task, so I will not do that. But I will, my takeaway is that I think the keynote presentation, followed by the very excellent discussions from distinguished panelists, and the questions from the floor, all added to a very rich source for, forthcoming research. And I can see, I can point out to a couple of them, which would be very new, and because I find it in Bangladesh very much. You see, your finding is that protectionism not only has increased in the past decade around the world, but also in South Asia. So you've shown that tariffs, average tariffs in South Asia are higher than other regions. That argument is always present. I think we had, if you listen to our panelists, they also point out that, you have to have protection. But my question there is, how high would you have these protections? I can understand. And how long would you like to have protection? So if you don't, in the context of Bangladesh, we have the highest possible tariffs compared to the rest of the world. Average world tariffs have come down to about 6%. I'm ignoring the reciprocal tariff phenomenon for now. But, in East Asia, in ASEAN countries, within the ASEAN, they're almost close to zero tariffs. So we asked the question in Bangladesh, and since you're the chief economist for South Asia region for the World Bank, I think Bangladesh is one of your concerns. And we haven't found the answer. Of course, the revenue implication is definitely quite a, it's a top priority. But this particular finding that you have done, I think you've done it for Sri Lanka and India. Perhaps we need to take a look at Bangladesh. But Bangladesh experience in the 1990s has been very clear. There has been no revenue impact. I mean, no negative revenue impact of the extensive, deep tariff liberalization, import liberalization in the 1990s. So right now, we might have some, revenue impact, but as you, after all, the objective of tariff reform and tariff reduction is to first bring it down from all the high levels that they are in Bangladesh and in other countries. And second, tariff reform, trade reform is expected to stimulate, bring some dynamism in the economy, not just for exports, and this is the point, also for imports. Imports have to grow in order to, support export expansion. And so these findings, and I think there should be more research going forward, particularly in the employment area. What are the industrial sectors in manufacturing? We have some evidence that export-oriented manufacturing has been generating more employment in Bangladesh than the import-substituting manufacturing. But this is one research that needs to be done. I think even other South Asian countries can look at it. So these are areas, and of course the very issue of trade reform plus labor market reforms combined give you the big bang for the buck, so to say. So these are some, new elements that you've added to the research agenda, I think, going forward. So I think, all in all, it was a very rich presentation as well as discussion. And I need to thank, Dr. Salim Rehan, Sanem, and the team for inviting me, giving me the honor and the privilege to chair this very exciting session. And I thank our distinguished panelists. Dr. Mustafiz is here. He's one of the top speakers in the media. So I'm sure he's going to have to tell them what was discussed here. And my friend from Nepal and a director from the Nepal Central Bank. So we acknowledge their contribution. And those who joined us online, I'm sorry we couldn't give you a bit more time, but we have just about run out of time. And thank you for the audience, Ivan, for having taken the time to listen to us. I'm sure we raised some controversial issues, some questions still bother your mind, and that is good. I know that there are a lot of students from the university, so this is one way to learn. So I hope that we all we did our best to give you a learning experience as well. With that, I thank you very much. Thank you, Sanem and Dr. Sanim Rahim.
Thank you.